FS preparation, focus on disclosures, part 2. Okay, so ano ba yung objectives ng training natin? Of course, to learn to identify yung key differences ng disclosures ng accounting frameworks. So, dito sa training natin, i-discuss natin yung key differences ng PFRS or full FSM, tulad ng kanina. And to learn to apply the appropriate and sufficient disclosures in preparing financial statements. To prepare financial statements in accordance with appropriate standards, and to familiarize how the standards are set to stay up to date. So, start tayo sa liabilities and equity in section 20. So, liabilities. So, what is a liability naman? So, a liability is a present obligation of an entity arising from past events, the settlement of which is expected to result in an outflow from the entity of resources embodying economic benefits. So, yung present obligation, it could be a legal or a constructive obligation. So, pag sinabi natin na legal obligation, as we all know, it is a commitment to pay a third party based on underlying contract. So, example niyan yung mga purchase order, mortgage, bond issuance. Yung constructive obligation naman, it arises if may past practice yung company ng valid expectation on the part of a third party. For example, may isang retail store that has long-standing policy of allowing customers to return merchandise within, let's say, 30-day period. So that is an example of constructive obligation. So, ito yung disclosure requirements para sa liabilities, which is discussed naman na din kanina. So, yung trade payables, financial liabilities, yung liabilities for current and yung non-current na taxes and provisions. So, they should be separately presented sa financial statements. So, here is a snip of the face of a financial statement. So, kinuha na lang namin yung liabilities portion. So, makikita natin dyan na may separate line item for the trade and other payables, yung financial liabilities like yung duty-related parties, yung taxes, yung current, which is income tax payable, kasi yung finance liability, finance lease liability. So, separately presented. So, take note na ang current, non-current assets natin shall be presented separately sa current and non-current na liabilities. Pero if it is more reliable or relevant na i-present siya on a liquidity, based on its liquidity, pwede natin siyang i-present based on liquidity. For example, yung lahat ng liabilities and lahat ng assets niya, pwede natin siyang i-base sa liquidity kahit magkakasama sila, group as one. For example, yung asset niya cash, tapos sumunod yung payable na agad, tapos sumunod yung receivable. So, pwede siyang i-present doon if it could provide more reliable and more relevant information. Next, yun na yung trade and other payables showing separately amounts payable to trade suppliers. So, for example, meron tayong mga trade payables sa mga related parties. So, yes, included siya dun sa trade payables natin na sa face ng financial statement. Pero pag binrate natin siya sa books, kailangan nandun pa rin siya sa related party. Meron pa rin siyang separate na disclosure na meron tayong mga trade receivables or payables sa related parties. Next is yung provision for employee benefits and other provisions, separately presented siya. So here is an example of a disclosure ng accounting policy. So we have to remember, lahat ng mga accounts na meron tayo sa libro natin, meron dapat siyang corresponding accounting policy. Diba? Kapag nag-review tayo ng financial statements, sabay-sabay natin chine-check yan from case, kasabay na natin na nire-review or chine-check yung accounting policy niya. Tapos yung corresponding notes niya. So, very important yung accounting policy. Next, for equity. So, what is an equity? Equity is the residual interest in the entity's assets after deducting all its liabilities. So, it includes yung mga investments ng owners of the entity plus yung mga additional investments, yung profit or income, plus yung mga reductions in investments, and mga losses. So, ito yung disclosure requirements naman for equity. Ayan, so ito yung example. So, sabi doon, kailangan nandun yung number of shares authorized. Which is ito siya. Number of shares issued and fully paid. So, dapat stated din siya. Yung par value per share. Ayan. Yung issued and outstanding. Ayan siya. So, if meron din tayong mga subscribed shares, it should be presented as well. Ayan. Sabi dito, what if an entity has no share capital? So, if walang share capital, ano yung magiging disclosure requirement? So, it is seen dun sa as if meron siyang share capital. So, sino lang tayo na sinusunod ng disclosure requirement. So, here is an example naman ng accounting policy for it. So, nakalagay dyan, if ever na, for example, meron tayong but ibang kinds of shares, like meron tayong common, meron tayong preferred, kailangan i-disclose din natin sila. Okay, so next is yung revenue. Section 23. So, what is a revenue? Yung revenue, it is the gross inflow of economic benefits during the period arising from the course of ordinary activities of an entity, and those inflows result in increases in equity other than increases relating to contributions from equity participants. So, yung income is different from revenue. Yung income kasi increases in economic benefits during the reporting period in the form of inflows or enhancements of assets or decreases in liabilities that result in increases in equity other than those relating to contributions from equity investors. So, yung income, it is referred to by a variety of terms, including yung sales, fees, interest, dividends, royalties, and rent. So for SME, ito yung categories of revenue. Meron tayong sale of goods, rendering of services, construction, contracts, interest, royalties, and dividends. So as to recognition, recognize na tayo, it is probable na may economic benefits will flow into the entity, and yung cost incurred or to be incurred in respect of the transaction can be measured reliably. So, recognition naman pagdating sa sale of goods. So, tanda lang natin, mag-recognize lang tayo ng sale of goods kapag na-transfer na sa buyer yung significant risks and rewards of ownership ng goods. And then the seller retains neither continuing managerial involvement to the degree usually associated with ownership nor effective control over the goods sold. And yung cost incurred or to be incurred can be measured reliably. For rendering of service naman, kailan tayo mag-recognize? So, same siya sa construction contract, which is, these are recognized by reference to the stage of completion of the transaction at the end of the reporting period. So, yun yung percentage of completion method. Sa interest naman, interest shall be recognized using the effective interest method naman. For royalties, it should be recognized on an accrual basis in accordance with the substance of the relevant agreement. And yung dividends naman shall be recognized when the shareholders' right to receive payment is established. So, what are the disclosure requirements? Of course, yung accounting policy and amount of each category. So, for example, yung company, meron siyang iba't ibang source of revenue. Meron, like for example, nagtitinda siya ng aircon. Nagtitinda siya ng aircon. Tapos, nag-render din siya ng service. Like, pati yung installation, kanya rin. Tapos, meron pa siyang mga pinapalis, for example, ng mga commercial spaces. So, if meron siyang iba't ibang category ng revenue, it should be disclosed separately. So, for revenue from construction contracts naman, yan, yung amount ng contract revenue should be disclosed, yung methods used to determine yung contract revenue, and yung methods used to determine yung stage of completion ng contracts in progress. Yung gross amount ng customers for contract work is considered as an asset, kasi yung gross amount naman due to customers for contract work is a liability. So here is an example, accounting policy for revenue. So naka-itemize dyan yung and with specific disclosures for accounting policy for each category. So dito naman sa financial statement, sa phase ng sa revenue and expenses and changes in fund balance, dito yung amount of each category of revenue. Okay. So, yung treatment, yung standards, and it differs yung sa full PFRS. So, ito yung bagong rules, which is effective January 2018, yung full PFRS. For full PFRS, yung PFRS 15. So, yung PFRS 15, meron siyang dinatawag na 5-step model. We have, first, no, identify the contract. So, a contract creates enforceable rights and obligations. So, pwede siyang written, oral, or implied by customary business practice. So, a contract with the customer will be within the scope of PFRS 15 if the following conditions are met. So, if yung contract has been approved by the parties to the contract, yung each party may write siya in relation to doon sa goods or service to be transferred. Yung payment terms or yung payment terms ng goods and services can be identified. Yung contract, meron siyang commercial substance, and it is probable that the consideration to which the entity is entitled in exchange for the goods or services will be collected. So, yun yung step na identify. So, if the contract with the customer does not meet all of the said criteria, nabig ko kanina, the entity will continue to reassess the contract going forward to determine whether it subsequently meets the above. Yung step po naman natin is we separate yung performance obligation. So we identify the performance obligations in the contract. From that point, the entity will apply PFRS 15 to the contract. So yung performance obligations are promises in a contract to transfer goods or services, including those a customer can resell or provide to its customers. So we use the models indicators to separate the performance obligations if they are capable of being distinct and if they are distinct based on the context and contract. After nating ma-separate yung performance obligation, we determine naman the transaction price. So, ano ba yung transaction price? It is the amount of the consideration a company is entitled to receive in exchange for transferring goods or services to customers. So, yung pagde-determine naman ng transaction price is straightforward siya. So, kapag yung contract price is fixed, straightforward siya. So, kapag yung contract price is fixed, nagiging complex lang siya kapag yung contract price ay hindi siya fixed. Next step is we allocate the transaction price. So the transaction price should be allocated to distinct performance obligations based on a relative standalone selling price. So this may be standalone selling price of a good or service when sold separately to a customer in similar circumstances and to similar customers. Because standalone selling price is not directly observable, estimate it by considering all information that is reasonably available, such as yung market conditions, specific factors, and class of customers. After natin ma-allocate yung transaction price, we recognize the revenue. So we recognize revenue when the entity satisfies a performance obligation. So recognize revenue when the promised goods or services are transferred to the customer and the customer obtains control. So this may be over time or at a point in time. So the new standard provides indicators when control is transferred. The disclosure requirements are as follows in. Yung qualitative and quantitative information about the contract, yung significant judgments and changes in significant judgments, and any assets recognized from the cost to obtain or fulfill a contract with the customer. Yung contract with the customers, PFRS 15 requires revenue and impairment losses arising from contracts with customers to be disclosed separately from items not arising from contracts with customers. So, sa full PFRS, if meron tayong mga revenues na hindi siya pasok dun sa PFRS 15, which is revenue from contracts, like for example, pasok siya as lease or pasok siya as interest, should be separately presented. Disaggregation of revenues naman, it requires disclosure of disaggregated revenue from customers from contracts with customers with application guidelines. Obviously, there is no predetermined list of revenue categories to be presented. Instead, PFRS 15 states that entities should take into account how the information about revenue is presented in other external and internal financial communication. So, yung contract balances need din siyang i-disclose yung performance obligations, significant judgments, contract costs recognized as assets, and if meron practical expedients, we have to disclose na na-damage siya or it has been used. So, ito yung example natin ng disclosure. So, dito makikita natin na yung revenue from contracts with customers are separately presented dun sa mga revenue from other sources. Disaggregation of revenues. Nakaseparate yung transfer of goods dun sa mga services over time. Next, yung contract balances. So, meron kasing part doon na mag-arrange as contract assets or liability. So, kailangan meron din tayong, ma-present din natin yung contract assets and liabilities or yung contract balances. Next is ito, pinapakabit performance obligations and significant judgments. So, ito naman yung example ng accounting policy for PFRS 15. So, for the next section, we have government grants. So, almost every government supports certain companies or business by providing grants or other kinds of assistance. So, as this is clear benefit and advantage comparing with other companies without such an assistance, it should be properly reported sa financial statements natin. So, what is a government grant? Government grants are assistance by government in the form of transfers of resources to an entity in return for past or future compliance with certain conditions relating to the operating activities of the entity. So, yung mga income tax holidays, investment tax credits, reduced income tax rates, accelerated depreciation allowances. Pag tinignan natin, these are from government, diba? But these are excluded sa government grants. Ang isang example ng government grants is yung mga government loans. So, yung PFRS, yung sa PFRS and Section 24 does not cover government assistance that is provided for an entity in the form of benefits that the taxable determine taxable profit or loss. So, ito yung key differences ng PFRS for SME sa full PFRS. Yung SME, katulad naman ito kanina, hindi niya cover yung government assistance. While sa PFRS, covered niya yung government assistance. Hindi covered ng PFRS for SME yung repayment ng government grants. Sa PFRS, covered niya. Sa PFRS for SME, it includes yung government grants related to agriculture. Sa PFRS naman, sa full PFRS naman, hindi siya covered ng section na to kasi covered siya dun sa passport 1, which is agriculture. Sa PFRS for SMEs, yung mga non-monetary assets must be measured at the fair value of the asset receivable. While sa full PFRS, it can be measured either at the fair value of the asset received or at the nominal amount. So, how to recognize and measure ang government grants? Sabi dyan, government grants, including non-monetary grants, shall not be recognized until there is a reasonable assurance that the entity will comply with the conditions attached to the grants and the grants will be received. So, if yung government grants is meron na siyang mga past cost na na-incur, immediately, ang pasok niya is sa P&L. For current naman and future cost, papasok siya sa P&L in the period when costs are recognized. So yung next section is borrowing costs. So, paminsan nalilito pa rin tayo or natatanong natin, should we capitalize borrowing costs or not? So when it comes to determining the cost of our assets, most standards ask to include all directly attributable items. And let us be honest, no, na borrowing money does carry a cost and sometimes a very significant one pa siya. So ano nga ba yung borrowing cost? Borrowing costs are interest and other costs that an entity incurs in connection with the borrowing of funds and include interest expense calculated using the effective interest method. Exchange differences arising from foreign currency borrowings to the extent that they are recorded as an adjustment to interest cost. So, yung qualifying asset measured at fair value and yung mga inventories that are manufactured or otherwise produced in large quantities on a repetitive basis, hindi siya kasama part ng borrowing. As to recognition naman and measurement, for PFRS for SMEs, all borrowing costs are expensed in P&L in the period in which they are incurred. Walang kinakapitalize. For full PFRS naman, if the borrowing cost is directly attributable to the acquisition, construction, or production of a qualifying asset as part of the cost, that asset are capitalized. All other borrowing costs are expensed. So expensing borrowing costs is a major difference between PFRS for SMEs and full PFRS. So for many entities, this will be simpler to apply as SMEs will not need to calculate the borrowing cost to be capitalized. However, in some industries, such as yung mga real estate industry, expensing borrowing costs may be disadvantageous as the costs will be recognized in P&L in the period which they are incurred, which may lead to greater volatility in earnings. Therefore, entities will need to consider whether this is a significant factor for their business before deciding to adopt PFRS for SMEs. So, what are the disclosure requirements for borrowing costs? So, accounting policy, yung amount of interest expense, and for full PFRS, the amount of borrowing cost capitalized during the period and the capitalization. So here in our example, statement of comprehensive income, naka-separate line item yung finance cost. So for the next section, which is share-based payment. So transactions whereby companies pay for the goods or services received by issuing shares or similar instruments are very common in these days. So in fact, their volume of rapidly increasing because many people, including top management members, regard having shares of the company as very exclusive and rewarding. So paano ba yung treatment ng ganyan? Mga share-based transactions or payments? Before that, i-define muna natin ano ba yung share-based payment. So, a share-based payment is a transaction in which the entity receives goods or services either as consideration of its equity instruments or by incurring liabilities for amounts based on the price of the entity's share of other instruments of the entity. So, the accounting requirement for share-based payment depend on how the transaction will be settled. So, Could be an issuance of equity, cash, or equity or cash. So when you receive goods or services, like nun is yung equity instrument or liability, dun papasok ang share-based payment. As to recognition and measurement, for PFRS, for SME and pool, you obtain the goods or as the services are received. For equity, um, minimeasure natin siya as equity if the goods are received in an equity-settled share-based payment transaction. Liability naman if acquired in a cash-settled share-based payment transaction. Kapag hindi siya nag-qualify as assets, in-expense natin siya. How about yung recognition of vesting conditions? So, meron kasi mga share-based payments na may mga vesting conditions. So, if the share-based payment do not vest until the completion of a specified period of service. Within the vesting period natin siya i-recognize. The principle applied is that if the share-based payments do not vest until the completion of a specified period of service, the entity presumes the services rendered by the counterparty will be received during the vesting period. Hence, the entity recognizes the share-based payment for those services received during the vesting period. So, for PFRS for SMEs, explicitly stated dun na ang may vesting conditions lang nila is for employees. So, yun yung difference nila sa as to measurement, so, we recognize share-based transaction. So, pwede siyang maging cash settled, pwede rin siyang equity. So, if cash settled siya, we debit yung asset or yung expense account and credit liability. Tapos, ang magiging measurement is yung fair value ng liability. If equity settled naman siya, we debit as per expense and then credit equity, yung magiging measurement niya naman is fair value ng goods or service na received if hindi yun available, yung fair value ng equity. So, as the disclosure requirements, accounting policy, same lang naman for SME and full. The fair value of the goods or services received, the fair value of equity instruments granted during the period was determined, the effect of share-based payment transactions on the entity's profit or loss for the period and its financial position. So, the entity must disclose information that enables users of the financial statements to understand the nature and extent of a share-based payment arrangement in existence during the period by disclosure. So, here is an example ng accounting policy. Ito yung nature ng equity plan. So, we also have here yung table ng, that shows the total expense of the share-based payment plans. So, nandito rin yung movement ng liability and equity. Yung table that shows the valuation method ng group share-based payment plans. and yung fair value measurement. So for the next section, which is impairment of assets. So did you know that the worldwide economic crisis followed by the recession caused a sharp downfall of assets prices? So in some countries, the prices of property fell by 30 to 50%. So those are steep and fast decrease had an impact on the PFRS financial reporting too. Companies showing assets in their accounts had to assess their book value. Hmm. So dito papasok yung impairment of assets. So what should we do when we think the value of our assets went down? And how do you determine it? Hmm. Define muna natin paano natin masasabi na impaired yung assets natin. If the carrying amount or yung accounting records is greater than the recoverable amount. Hmm. Yung recoverable amount is the fair value less cost of disposal or the value in usage higher. Hmm. So this scope, it covers all assets other than deferred tax assets, assets ng arising from employee benefits, yung mga financial assets, hindi siya covered ng impairment of assets na section na to. Yung investment property measured at fair value, yung biological assets, yung inventories, covered, assets arising from construction contracts, yung mga deferred acquisition costs and intangible assets arising from an insurer's contractual rights, and yung mga non-current assets classified as held for sale. So, hindi siya covered ng scope na to. Pero yung inventories hanggang dun sa non-current assets classified as held for sale, covered siya ng PFRS for SME Section 27. So, covered siya nito. So, ano ba yung differences ng PFRS impairment of assets? So, yung impairment of assets for SMEs, diretso siya ng profit or loss. For PFRS, full PFRS naman, profit or loss siya unless it is carried at the valued amount. So, the existence of impairment indication, so ito nabanggit na rin ito kanina, baka ito usually yung common mistakes natin, na inisip natin na kapag PFRS for SMEs, tinetest for impairment lang, tinetest lang impairment indicators. Sorry, tinetest lang siya if may existence of impairment indicators. So, mali yun, no? Yung existence ng impairment indicators is assessed at each reporting date. Yung assets are tested for impairment when there is an indication that the asset will be impaired. For SME, yung intangible assets with indefinite useful life or an intangible asset not yet available for use, and yung mga goodwill. For full PFRS, kahit na walang indication, tinetest pa rin siya for impairment. So, ito yung mga disclosure requirements. Impairment losses recognized in P&L. Impairment losses reversed in P&L. Yung line item ng statement of comprehensive income, yung impairment losses ng revalued assets. So, for PFRS for SMEs, impairment losses are revalued assets recognized in other comprehensive income only for PPE. Kasi yung ibang assets, wala tayong revaluation only for PPE. For PFRS, same lang siya sa lahat. Just that lahat ng assets, pwede siyang to carry an extravagant amount. Okay. So, if meron tayong mga reportable segments, so for SMEs, wala naman siya na-require na disclosure. For full PFRS, na-require niya yung impairment losses, recognize yung mga na-reverse na impairment losses. If material yung individual impairment loss, hindi din siya i-disclose. Yung events and circumstances resulting in the impairment loss, yung amount ng loss or reversal, yung individual asset, yung nature and segment, yung cash generating unit, the description, amount of impairment loss, the class of assets and segment. The recoverable amount is fair value less cost of disposal, level of the fair value hierarchy, and if recoverable amount has been determined on the basis of value in use or on the basis of fair value less cost of disposal using a present value. So, if material din yung mga impairment losses in aggregate to the financial statements as a whole, for full PFRS, dinidisclose din natin yung mga main classes of assets affected and yung mga events and circumstances. So, ito yung example natin ng accounting policy para sa impairment ng assets. And dito naman, makikita natin na dinisclose din dito yung um, impairment losses. So for the next section, which is employee benefits, section 20. So yung employee benefits, it prescribes rules for recognition and presentation of various types of benefits that the employers provide to their employees. So actually, I found parang a fun fact about Google. So meron na silang employee benefits that the best employer in the world. Ang sabi is si Google daw na provide siya sa employees. So just to name a few of them, besides great salaries, meron silang mga free haircuts, meron silang high-tech cleansing toilets, on-site medical care, travel insurance, fan staff around the office, mga paid maternity leave, etc. Even Google even introduced yung death benefit. So, if a Google employee dies during his employment, his spouse continues to receive 50% of employee's annual salary for the next decade. So, but let us take a look if tayo yung CFO. So, no problem to account for the benefits such as salaries or pay haircuts. But what about the death benefit? The issue here is that the benefit is not paid while the employee is in service. Only after it, you should know that benefit. So Google really does know when the employees die, and thus the liability becomes payable. So dito papasok yung employee benefits na section 28 and yung AS 19 naman for full efforts. It will tell us how to account for various kinds of employee benefits and how to present them in the financial statements. So ano ba yung employee benefits? These are all forms of consideration given by an entity in exchange for services rendered by its employees. So these benefits include salary-related benefits such as yung wages, profit sharing bonuses, long service leave and share-based payments. Meron din ang mga termination benefits such as severance for redundant pay, and post-employee benefits such as retirement benefit plans. So yung post-employment benefits, it includes yung mga pensions, termination, indemnities, post-employment life insurance, and post-employment medical care. So yung mga pensions and termination indemnities are provided to employees through other defined contribution plans or defined benefit plans. So, meron pa tayong tinatawag na defined contribution plans, then meron pa tayong defined benefit plans. So, whether an arrangement is a defined contribution plan or defined benefit plan depends on its terms and conditions. So, ayan, for employee, employer, in exchange of service or work, they receive benefit or salary. Ang main objective naman ng section na to is to prescribe accounting and disclosure for employee benefits. It requires an entity to recognize a liability when an employee has provided service in exchange for employee benefits to be paid in the future. So, if ever na-render na ng employee yung service, magiging liability na the company. And to recognize an expense when the entity consumes the economic benefits arising from service provided by an employee in exchange for employee benefits. So that is the clear demonstration of matching principles to recognize an expense in the period when matching revenue is recognized. So yung kanina sa Google, they should recognize the liability for its death benefit when the employee actually works and not when he dies. So the expense when the results of employees' works are should be recognized already. So as discussed earlier, here are the classifications of employee benefits. We have short term. So yung short term, these are within 12 months. Tapos for current employees lang. Yung post-employment benefits naman, these are benefits after completion of employment, other than termination benefits. So, this may include yung mga vacation, yung mga matatagal na vacation paid leaves na binag-grant ng company's employees. Pwede siya isama ng mga wish for other long-term employee benefits. So, dito siya papasok. Yung other than any other category for current employees. Yung post-employment benefits, sorry, ang kasama pala dito yung mga pension funds, retirement funds. Next is the termination benefits naman. This is the result of terminating employees before retirement. So, yung differences ng SME and group, the contribution payable for a period by the employer to the fund is recognized as a liability for defined contribution plan after deducting any amount already paid. Sa PFRS, pareho lang siya, pero if the contributions to a defined contribution plan do not fall due wholly within 12 months after the end of the year, the future contributions are discounted. Sa PFRS for SMEs kasi wala siyang discuss dito na discounted siya. Another difference is an entity recognizes a liability for its obligation under defined benefit plans, net of plan assets. It recognizes the net change in that liability during the period as the cost of its defined benefit plan during the period. Sa full naman, similar lang siya except for the following. Meron silang actuarial gains or losses that can be recognized immediately, either in P&L or in OCI. Or pwede rin siyang i-differ using the corridor method, whereby yung gains and losses are amortized into profit or loss over the expected remaining lives of participating employees. Tapos yung past service costs are recognized in profit or loss on a straight line basis over the average period until the plan amendments vest. Kung sa PFRS for SMEs, ina-expand siya dun sa period as the cost of its defined benefit plan during the period. Dito, pwede siyang on a straight line basis. For PFRS for SMEs, the defined benefit liability is the net total of the present value of the defined benefit plan ending less yung fair value ng plan assets. While for full PFRS naman, the defined benefit liability is the net total of the present value ng defined benefit end plus minus yung actuarial gains or losses less yung unrecognized past service cost less yung fair value ng plan assets. So, yun lang naman yung difference nila. Kasi for SME, wala silang mga actuarial gains or losses and wala silang mga recognized na past service cost. Another difference is, for accrued benefit valuation method, it's required if available or can be obtained without undue cost or effort. Alternatively, future salary progression, future service, and possible mortality during an employee's period of service are not considered. So, for SMEs, ina-encourage din naman talaga na magkaroon ng mga valuation reports para din sa benefit nila. Pero in case talaga na hindi kaya, pwede siyang gawin yung future salary progression gamit yung future service and possible mortality during the employee's period of service. Pero for full PFRS, only accrued benefit valuation method is permitted. Another difference for employee benefits, no distinction between expected and actual return on plan assets. The changes in the fair value of plan assets are recorded in profit or loss. For PFRS naman, mayroong expected return on plan assets. Based siya sa market conditions or expectations at the beginning of the period for returns over the entire life of the related obligations on plan assets is an actuarial gain or loss. So for SME, walang expected and actual return ng plan assets directly sa P&L. For full PFRS, meron silang mga expect na return on plan assets, tapos to be recognized actuarial gain or loss. For short-term employee benefits naman, wala namang specific requirement sa standards. Pero dito mag-a-apply yung disclosures na ni-require sa mga key management personnel. Like for example, sa key management personnel, required na i-disclose yung short-term employee benefits of the entity's key management personnel. Ito siya papasok. So ito yung example ng disclosure key management personnel. So ito, example to for full PFRS. So later, discuss natin siya further sa related party transactions kasi part to ng related party transaction disclosures. Next naman, disclosure requirement naman for post-employment benefits na defined contribution plan. So, di ba meron tayong post-employment benefits na defined contribution plan, meron din tayong defined benefit plan. So, ito yung disclosure para sa defined contribution plan. So, sa SME, yung amount recognized as an expense should be disclosed. It treats a defined benefit multi-employer plan as a defined contribution plan because sufficient information is not available to use defined benefit accounting. It shall disclose the fact that it is a defined benefit plan and the reason why it is being accounted for as a defined contribution plan, along with any available information about the plan's surplus or deficit and the implications, if any, for the entity. For full PFRS, amount recognized as an expense for defined contribution plans. Yun lang yung requirement. So here is an example ng disclosure for defined contribution plan. So, disclose din natin dito yung accounting policy and then yung policy mismo ng plan. And yung amount recognized in PFL. So, next naman natin is yung disclosure requirement for post-employment benefits ng defined benefit plan. So, ito medyo mahaba lang siya. Medyo maraming requirement for defined benefit plan. Anyway, we can give you naman copy of our training materials. Hindi naman natin need to sabihin lahat ng disclosure requirements. We can check naman kasi meron naman tayong mga disclosures checklist, SEP. So, it could serve as our guide disclosures or ng pag-prepare natin ng financial statement. So, pwede yun i-check natin. For example, for meron tayong client na merong employment benefits. So, pwede natin i-check doon ano ba yung dapat na disclosure requirement. Ano ba yung mga disclosure requirement? Okay. So, ito na lang tayo sa example. So, dito, dinisclose niya yung general description ng type ng plan, including yung funding policy. So, actually, medyo marami talaga siya. So, ang tip ko lang siguro kasi, for ano naman, for post-employment post-employment benefits, meron naman tayong valuation. So, lahat ng mga need natin na information, pwede natin siyang makuha doon. Tapos hindi niyo ilalagay natin sa financial statements. So, we have to show yung reconciliation ng opening balances and closing balances ng mga net defined benefit liability natin. So, ano yung kino-compose nun? We have to indicate here. Yung actuarial valuations, ito kasi example of this for full PFRS. So, actuarial valuations na obtained from independent actuary, we also have to disclose it. Like kung anong klase ng retirement expenses yun, magiging part ko ng cost of sales, cost of production, expense ba siya. Yung carrying value ng plan assets, dito rin siya. I-disclose din natin siya. Also, the amount of remeasurement losses, net of income tax, recognized in OCI. So, for long-term benefits naman, sa termination benefits, ang requirement lang na i-disclose is yung nature ng benefits, yung accounting policy, saka yung amount ng obligation and the funding status ng reporting. So, before tayo mag-proceed dun sa next few sections natin, let us have a quick break siguro for 5 minutes. Okay, proceed tayo. So, for the next section, income tax. So, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. So, income tax is something that can hardly be avoided by a profit-making company. So, you might find filling in the tax return a demanding task, but because everything must be correct, otherwise you're asking for penalties from the BIR or the tax office. On top of that, you still need to calculate deferred tax, so which is for accounting naman. Yung deferred income tax daw belongs to the top 10 reasons of accountants' headaches because of its concepts and application is not easy to understand. So, so when it comes to PFRS and PFRS resumes financial statements, a lot of them contain errors exactly in a deferred taxation. So this section will be a guide for us in the area of income taxes in Philippines. It's not an interesting, easy to read novel. So before before we proceed dun sa disclosure, define muna natin ano ba yung tax. So what is an income tax? An income tax is a government tax on the taxable profit earned by an individual or corporation. So income tax includes all domestic and foreign taxes that are based on taxable profit. So it also includes payable by a subsidiary, associate, or joint venture on distributions to the reporting entity. Taxes that are not income taxes, such as value-added taxes or yung mga business taxes, are accounted for according to the accounting standards governing the balance sheet or income statement item they are contained in. So income tax, we have current and deferred. So ano ba yung difference nila? So as to substance, yung current income tax is payable to tax office. So pag sinabi natin na ito yung tax due, ito yung current. Yung deferred naman, ito ang substance niya is yung accounting measure. Ano yung basis? Basis for current income tax is yung taxable profit or loss. Yung basis naman ng deferred income tax is yung temporary differences. As to timing, so yung current income tax is for the current period and sa deferred naman is for future periods. So temporary differences, nabanggit dyan kanina as a basis ng deferred income tax. So yung temporary differences, these are differences between the tax basis of an asset or liability and its carrying amount in the financial statements that will result in a taxable or deductible amount and the carrying amount of the asset or liability is recovered or settled. Recognition and measurement as to current taxes. So, pareho lang sila. Yung mga unpaid current tax for current and prior periods are liabilities. If the amount already paid naman is higher than the amount due of the excess, is recognized as an asset. The benefit relating to a tax loss that can be carried back to recover current tax of a previous period is recognized as an asset. So, ito naman yung tinatawag natin na NOLCO. So, As to measurement, the amount expected to be paid to or recovered from the taxation authority using the tax rates that have been enacted or substantively enacted by the reporting date. So, for SME and pool, same sila lahat except for the discounting ng current taxes. Kasi for SME, sinabi doon na hindi siya discounted, pero for full PFRS or sa PS12, silent siya when it comes to discounting. Pero in practice naman, hindi naman talaga tayo nag-discount din ng current taxes. So, next naman is for deferred taxes. So, deferred tax is provided for all temporary differences and the carry forward of unused tax losses with a few exceptions. So, the amounts of income tax payable, potentially recoverable in future, in respect of taxable or deductible temporary differences and the carry forward of unused tax losses and tax credits. So, for PFRS for SMEs, meron tayong valuation allowance. So, yung valuation allowance is recognized so that the net carrying amount of the deferred tax asset equals the highest amount that is more likely not to be recovered. The valuation allowance is adjusted to reflect the current assessment of future taxable. So, for pool, yung valuation allowance is not acceptable. So, for pool, we only recognize deferred taxes if it is probable that there will be sufficient future taxable profit to enable recovery of the deferred tax assets. So, same naman sila na yung they are measured using the tax rate and the tax laws that apply or have been substantively enacted by the reporting date. So, hindi rin siya discounted kahit na-deferred siya. And the net carrying amount of the deferred tax asset is reviewed at each reporting date. Okay, so management offsets current tax assets and current tax liabilities, or offsets deferred tax assets and deferred tax liabilities only when it has a legally enforceable right to set the amounts. So, yan, pwede lang tayo mag-offset if there is a legally enforceable right to offset. For SME, an entity recognizes the effect of the possible outcomes for review by the tax authorities. Pero for PFRS, walang specific effects. Yun lang yung difference. So, for the disclosure requirement, so, we need to disclose yung current na tax expense. So, usually makikita naman natin yan sa notes sa financial statements ng income taxes. If merong mga adjustments recognized in the period for current tax of prior periods, yung amount ng deferred tax expense or income relating to the original and reversal of temporary differences, yung amount ng deferred tax expense relating to changes naman ng tax rates if meron, or imposition ng new taxes, yung amount ng tax expense relating to changes sa accounting policies and errors, the aggregate current and deferred tax relating to items that are recognized as items of other comprehensive income. So, dinidisclose din natin yan. Kasi di ba meron tayong isang mga OCI items. For each type of temporary difference and for each type of unused tax losses and tax credits, we disclose yung amount ng deferred tax liabilities, yung deferred tax assets, yung valuation allowances at the end of the reporting period, and an analysis of the change in deferred tax liabilities, tax assets, and valuation allowances during. Also, dinidisclose natin yung expiry date, if any, ng mga temporary differences, ng mga unused tax losses and unused tax credits. So, nakalagay yung lahat sa notes to financial statements natin. Like, if kailan yung expiration ng MC, ng excess MC, yung expiration ng bulk, so, need siyang nakadisclose. And so, ito yung mga examples. Accounting policy comes to income taxes. Yung current and deferred portion ng income tax expense. Yung reconciliation. Ito lang siya. Then yung breakdown ng net deferred tax assets. So next is the foreign currency translation. So siguro just an introduction to this section. For foreign currency transaction, tayo, di ba, we love to sell, buy, import, export, trade together, and to do many things, other things, all in foreign currencies. So, meron tayong ganun part. When you look at the business world, you will see that business go global in 2 ways. So, they either have individual transactions in foreign currencies, or when they grow bigger, they often set up foreign operations or separate business abroad. Moreover, the exchange rates change every minute. So, how to bring a bit of organization into this currency mix-up? So, ito yung sagot dun sa natin for foreign currency translation. But before that, let us define ano muna yung functional currency. So, functional currency is the currency of the primary of economic environment in which the entity operates. Yung presentation currency naman, this is the currency in which the financial statements are presented. So, all components ng financial statements, they are measured in the functional currency. So, we have to take note of that. They are measured in the functional currency. All transactions entered into in currencies other than the functional currency are treated as transactions in a foreign currency. So, as to recognition and measurement, same lang for SME and PU. A transaction in a foreign currency is recorded in the functional currency using the exchange rate at the date of transaction. So, kung meron tayong mga foreign currency na transaction, pag ni-record natin siya as accountants, gagamitin natin is yung rate ng date of transaction. At the end of each reporting period naman, the foreign currency monetary balances are translated using the exchange rate at the closing rate. Kaya nagkakaroon tayo ng mga foreign exchange gains or losses. Kasi may difference dun sa date of transaction and sa closing rate. So, yung mga non-monetary balances denominated in foreign currency are carried at cost report using the exchange rate at the date of the transaction. At the fair value reported using the exchange rate at the date when the fair values were determined. So a transaction in a foreign currency is recorded in the functional currency using the exchange rate at the date of the transaction. We may use average rates if they do not fluctuate significantly. Exchange differences on monetary items are recognized in profit or loss. So for both ano naman, standards, for both framework, they are reported in the profit or loss. Difference arising on a monetary item that forms part of an entity's net investment in a foreign entity are recognized as a separate component. So, ang difference ng SME sa pool is that, di ba meron tayong mga, yung katulad ng banggit dito, yung monetary item, um, that forms part of an entity's net investment in a foreign entity, ni-recognize siya as a separate component sa equity. So, for PFRS, for SME, yung pagre-recycling to profit or loss, recycling through profit or loss, or of any cumulative exchange differences that were previously recognized in equity and disposal of foreign operation is not permitted. While dun sa full PFRS, yung exchange differences dun sa monetary item that forms part of a net investment in a foreign operation, they are classified from equity to profit or loss once ma-dispose yung foreign operation. So, yun yung difference ng SMEs. So, a change is justified only if there are changes in underlying transactions, events, and conditions that are relevant to the entity. The effect of change in functional currency is accounted for prospectively from the date of the change. So, presentation naman. Dito naman tayo sa presentation currency. So, an entity may choose to present its financial statements in any currency, as what I have stated before. If the presentation currency differs from the functional currency, an entity translates its results and financial position into the presentation currency. So, paano natin siya ita-translate? Yung assets and liabilities, they are being valued using the closing rate at the date of the statements of financial position. Yung income and expenses naman, we use the exchange rates at the date of the transactions. So, pwede namang din gamitin daw yung average rates if they do not fluctuate significantly. So, all resulting exchange differences are recognized in OCI. So, yung cumulative translation differences on foreign operations initially recognized in equity, they remain in equity pag sa SME. So, kasi katulad yung nabit ko kanina, hindi hindi permitted na magkaroon ng recycling ng profit or loss. Recycling from equity to profit or loss. So, it remains equity for SME. For full PFRS naman, yung cumulative translation differences on foreign operations initially recognized in equity are recycled to P&L upon disposal. So there are entities in the group that may have different functional currencies. So when we prepare consolidated financial statements, the financial statements of all entities are translated into the reporting entity's presentation currency. So what are the disclosure requirements? The amount of exchange differences recognized in P&L during the period, except for those arising on financial instruments measured at fair value to profit and loss. Yung amount ng exchange differences arising during the period and classified in a separate component of equity at the end of the period, yung currency in which the financial statements are presented, the fact and the reason for the change in functional currency. So an entity shall disclose the currency in which the financial statements are presented. When the presentation currency is different from the functional currency, an entity shall state the fact and shall disclose the functional currency and the reason for using a different presentation currency. So, ito yung example natin ng disclosure. So, nandyan yung amount exchange for the foreign exchange paper loss. Yung accounting policy. So, next section is the hyperinflation. So, all components of the financial statements are measured in the functional currency. All transactions entered into in currencies other than the functional currency are treated as transactions in a foreign currency. So, dito na papasok yung hyperinflation. So, hyperinflation is indicated by characteristics of the economic environment of a country. One of the indicators is the cumulative inflation rate over the 3 years is approaching or exceeds 100%. So, ano ba yung definition nun? Hyperinflation. It is a term to describe rapid, excessive, and out-of-control general price increases in an economy. So, yung disclosure requirement naman natin dyan is yung the fact na the financial statements and the prior period date have been restated for changes in the general purchasing power of the functional currency, the identity and level of the price index at the reporting date, and changes during the current reporting period and the previous reporting period, and the amount of gain or loss on monetary items. So, ito hindi naman common na merong hyperinflation. So, yung next natin is yung events after the end of the reporting period. So, this standard naman, this is in fact one of the oldest standards in place already. So, yung events after the end of the reporting period, this standard is sweet and short, and often it is seen as a minor thing compared to other complex standards na diniscuss natin. However, the ongoing pandemic of coronavirus brought this standard to light. So clearly, the biggest effects of pandemic when businesses happened in 2020 after the end of 2019 reporting year. So, ano ba yung sinasabi ni standards about events like this? Should we adjust or not? So, let us define first uh, what are events after the end of the reporting period. So, these are events favorable or unfavorable that occur between the end of the reporting period and the date when the financial statements are authorized for issue. So let's say ang year end that is December 31, 2019 and na-issue yung financial statements on January 15. So yung January 1 to 15, yun yung tinatawag na event. Yun yung time natin ng after the end of the reporting period, lahat ng events within those time. So, the events after the end of the reporting period, meron tayong adjusting and non-adjusting events. So, paano ba natin malalaman if adjusting or non-adjusting event siya? So, pag adjusting, the conditions exist at the end of the reporting period. So, ibig sabihin, at the end of the reporting period, nag-e-exist yung condition na yun. So, we have to adjust yung amounts. For non-adjusting naman, may indicative of conditions that arose after the reporting period. So, pag non-adjusting, we just have to disclose the event. So, ano ba yung mga examples ng adjusting events? So, ito naman yung mga usual na natin na naririnig. Yung court cases settled after the end of the reporting period. And it confirms that an entity had a present obligation and should have created a provision in line with PAS 37. So, that is an example of adjusting event. Although yung court case settled na siya after the end of the nasettle siya after the end of the reporting period. Pero at the end of the reporting period, meron na dapat yung provision kasi meron na siyang present obligation. Yung bankruptcy of a customer after the end of the reporting period confirming that a client was credit impaired and ECL should have been recognized in line with PFRS 9. So, yun. Kapag meron din ganito, bankruptcy ng customer, since part siya ng PFRS 9 that you have to assess yung ECL ng customers natin. So, magiging adjusting event na rin siya. Discovery of errors or fraud showing that the financial statements are incorrect. These are adjusting events. So, yung profit sharing or bonus payments then that are determined after the end of the reporting period also suggest that there was a present obligation at year end. So, it's also an adjusting event. So, for non-adjusting events naman, since these are events that are indicative of conditions that arose after the reporting period. So, sa mga examples nito would be yung mga natural disasters, wars, pandemics, etc. happening after the reporting period. Kaya yung naging yung effect ng pandemic sa companies, naglalagay tayo ng events, nagdi-disclose tayo, dinidisclose natin yung events na yun after the reporting period. Meron tayong separate disclosure for that. So, ano ba yung dinidisclose natin doon? Kapag mayroong gano'n na mga non-adjusting events, we have to disclose yung nature ng event and the estimate of its financial effect. So, ito pa yung mga disclosure requirements. The fact that the financial statements and prior period data have been restated for changes in the general purchasing power. Okay. So, ito yung example natin ng disclosure ng events after reporting date. So, meron tayong accounting policy and yung separate note disclosure para dun sa event itself. So, ang nilagay natin dito yung example is yung nangyaring pandemic last year. So, the current pandemic is non-adjusting event because the most businesses are affected by the measures taken by the government to stop the spread and not by the virus itself. But let me make this point clear then na the impact of the measures on their business resulting is so severe that your business will not survive, then the going concern no longer applies. You should not prepare the financial statements under the going concern assumption. If um, if during preparation ng financial statements, nagkaroon ng pandemic, tapos na-assess natin na malaki yung nag-impact niya sa business or sa company. It is so severe na it will not survive. So yung financial statements natin, dapat it is prepared So the next section is the related party disclosures. So what are related party transactions? A related party transaction is a transfer of resources or services or obligations between related parties regardless of whether a price is charged. So, sino ba yung masasabi natin ng mga related parties? So, nilagay ko na lang dyan yung mga keywords. So, a related party is a person or entity that is related to the entity that is preparing its financial statements. A person or a close member of that person's family is related to a reporting entity if that person has control or joint control over the reporting entity, may significant influence over the reporting entity, member siya ng key management person of the reporting entity or a parent of the reporting entity. An entity is related to a reporting entity if any of the following conditions apply. Applies. So the entity and the reporting entity are members of the same group, which means that each parent subsidiary and fellow subsidiary is related to the others. Ibig sabihin may related party rin sila. One entity is an associate or joint venture of the other entity, or an associate or joint venture of a member of a group of which the other entity is a member. if both entities are joint ventures of the same third party, so related party sila. One entity is a joint venture of a third party, and the other entity is an associate of the third entity. The entity is a post-employment defined benefit plan for the benefit of employees of either the reporting entity or an entity related to the reporting entity. If the reporting entity is itself such a plan, the sponsoring employers are also related to the reporting entity. The entity is controlled or jointly controlled by a person identified, and a person identified has significant influence over the entity or is a member of the key management personnel of the entity. Lastly, the entity or any member of a group of which it is part provides key management personnel services to the reporting entity or to the parent of the reporting entity. So those are related parties. So what are the disclosure requirements? Yung relationships between parents and subsidiaries. For PFRS for SMEs, yung key management personnel compensation in total. For pool naman, in total din siya and for each of the following categories. So kung merong short-term, may post-employment, other long-term termination, service payments, they should be disclosed then separately. So sa relationships between parents and subsidiaries, they shall be disclosed irrespective of whether there have been related party transactions. So kahit na walang related party transactions between the parents and subsidiaries, it should be disclosed. So, katulad ng banggit kanina sa nakunang presenter, an entity shall disclose the name of its parent and, if different, the ultimate controlling party. If neither the entity's parent nor the ultimate controlling party produces financial statements available for public use, the name of the next most senior parent that does so shall be disclosed. So, ito pa yung mga disclosures, yung nature, yung related party transactions, yung nature, yung amount of transaction, amount of outstanding balances, terms and conditions, and guarantees, provisions for doubtful debts if ever na may mga bad debts dun sa related parties, sa receivables mo sa receivables mo sa related parties, expense recognized during the period in respect of bad or doubtful debts. So, ito yung example natin ng disclosures. So, accounting policy again. Yung key management personnel. And so, in this case, naka-full siya. So, um, naka-disclose separately in each category yung short-term and post-employment benefits, if meron. Next is yung related party transactions. Yung amount, nature, terms, conditions. So, ayan. Yun yung laman ng notes natin ng related parties. Next is the specialized activities, section 34, for SME. So, sa section na po, meron tong, meron siyang three items na separately, na merong mga separate standards for pool. So, it includes yung agriculture, extractive industries, and service concession arrangement. So, yung agriculture, yung agricultural activity is defined as the management by an entity of the biological transformation of biological assets for sale into agricultural produce or into additional biological assets. So, agricultural produce is defined as the harvested product of its biological assets. Biological asset is defined as a living animal or plant. Yung extractive industries naman, which is sa pool naman, siya, ito yung exploration for and evaluation of mineral resources. So, definition niya, it is the search of mineral resources, including minerals, oils, natural gas, and similar non-regenerative resources after the entity has obtained legal rights to explore in a specific area, as well as the determination of the technical feasibility and commercial viability of extracting the mineral resources. Next is yung service concession arrangement. So, ito naman yung mga arrangements with government or public sector bodies. So, ito yung contracts with private operator to develop or upgrade, operate, and maintain the grantor's infrastructure assets such as roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, energy distribution networks, prisons, or hospitals. And so the grantor controls or regulates what services the operator must provide using the assets, to whom and at what price, and also controls any significant residual interest in the assets at the end of the term of the arrangement. So, ano ba yung recognition and measurement sa agriculture? So it is measured at fair value less cost to sell, where such fair value is readily determinable without undue cost or effort. So both for PFRS, SMEs, and full PFRS. Where fair value is not used, the entity measures such assets as cost less any accumulated depreciation and any accumulated impairment losses. So katulad nga nabanggit nila, if hindi readily determinable yung fair value, pwede siyang gumamit ng cost less accumulated depreciation and impairment losses for SMEs. For PFRS naman, it is only allowed yung cost less accumulated depreciation and impairment losses, allowed lang siya if the fair value cannot be measured reliably. So may difference yung yung hindi readily determinable dun sa cannot be measured reliably. The agricultural produce harvested from biological assets is measured at fair value less estimated cost to sell at the point of harvest. So, measurement na. Yung gain or loss on initial recognition and from change in fair value are recognized in P&L of the period. For recognition and measurement naman ng extractive industries or exploration for and evaluation of mineral resources. So for SME, the entity that is engaged in exploration for evaluation or extraction of mineral resources accounts for expenditure on the acquisition or development of tangible or intangible assets. So, dito, yung expenditure sa acquisition development ng tangible assets and intangible assets, papasok siya dun sa section ng PPE and intangible assets na standards. While for full, meron silang specific na accounting for this. So, for full PFRS, they specify the accounting for exploration and evaluation of mineral resources that it allows entities to develop an accounting policy for these costs without specifically considering yung accounting policies, changes in accounting estimates, and errors, which may allow entities to continue recognizing assets and adoption of PFRS that would not otherwise be permitted. So, under PFRS for SMEs, an expenditure that does not meet...
Sasama. Ikaw lang?
So, under PFRS for SMEs, an expenditure that does not meet the recognition criteria ng tangible or ng PPE and intangible assets would not be recognized as an asset. So, this may cause significant differences to full PFRS as costs such as exploration and evaluation expenditures that may not be recognized as assets under these sections will have to be expensed by SMEs but may be capitalized under full PFRS. So, in short, pag yung expenses niya is hindi siya pumasok dun sa section ng PP and intangible for PFRS for SMEs, should be expensed. Pero kapag sa full PFRS naman, still it can be capitalized. So these are the disclosure requirements for agriculture. So if naka-fair value model, so we have to disclose yung description of each class of its biological assets. Like for example, meron tayong biological assets na meron tayong growing crops or meron naman tayong mga cattle. So we have to describe it. Yung methods ng significant assumptions applied in determining the fair value of each class, yung reconciliation ng changes na carrying amount between the beginning and the end of the current period. So, yung reconciliation, nandun dapat yung gains or loss arise from changes in the fair value, yung increase resulting from purchases, yung decrease resulting from harvest, yung increase resulting from business combinations, net exchange differences arising in the translation of financial statements into a different presentation currency and on the translation of a foreign operation into the presentation currency of the report and any other changes. If naka-cost model naman, kailangan natin i-disclose yung description, different description ng each class, yung explanation, bakit hindi natin ginamit yung fair value or bakit it could not be measured reliably, yung depreciation method used, useful lives, depreciation rates used, yung gross carrying amount, and accumulated depreciation at the beginning and end of the period. Disclosure requirement naman for service concession arrangements. So, ito kasi, diba katulad na binigit ko kanina, examples nito is yung mga contracts with the government. So, kumbaga parang revenue to the company. So, papasok siya dun sa section 23, which is yung revenue. Dun papasok yung disclosure requirement na. So, ito yung example ng disclosure for agriculture. So, we have their accounting policy. Accounting policy. Tapos nandito rin yung mismong notes ng agriculture. So, yung nabanggit kanina, description of each class of its biological asset. So, ito, naka-pair value siya. So, yung mga change in pair value. So, anything na that causes the increase and decrease dun sa pair value, we have to disclose it sa movements ng agriculture or ng biological asset. And then, if naka-cost naman siya, we have to disclose yung cost and accumulated depreciation. So, for the next slide, yung transition ng PFRS for SMEs. Transition to the PFRS for SMEs. So, recognition and measurement. So, one entity's date of transition to the PFRS for SMEs is the beginning of the earliest period for which the entity presents full comparative information in accordance with this PFRS in its first financial statements that conform to this PFRS. Okay, so paano natin i-recognize and i-measure yung transition? In the opening statement of financial position, entities must recognize all assets and liabilities whose recognition is required by the PFRS for SMEs. So, since magta-transition tayo from full to PFRS for SMEs, kailangan natin i-recognize lahat ng assets na nire-recognize as PFRS for SMEs. Tapos yung mga items na hindi nire-recognize under PFRS for SMEs, hindi natin siya recognize sa books natin. We also need to reclassify items recognized under a previous financial reporting framework as one type of asset, liability, or component of equity, but are a different type of asset, liability, or component of equity under this PFRS, and apply this PFRS in measuring all recognized assets and liabilities. So, disclosure requirements, transition. The entity shall explain how the transition from its previous financial reporting framework to this standard affect its reported financial position, financial performance, and the cash flows. So, need din natin i-disclose yung reconciliation, like the nature of each change in accounting policy, recognitions ng equity, the date ng transition to this standard, and the end of the latest period presented in the entity's most recent annual financial statements. Yung reconciliation din ng profit or loss. So, if an entity becomes aware of errors made under its previous financial reporting framework, the reconciliations required shall, to the extent practicable, distinguish the corrections of those errors from changes in accounting policies. So, papasok pala siya ng changes in accounting policies. If ever na merong may mga errors under dun sa previous na financial reporting framework. If an entity did not present financial statements for previous periods, it shall disclose the fact in its first financial statements that conform to this standard. So, we're down to our last section, which is yung components ng financial report submitted to SEC. So, what are the components? Report submitted. You have the statement of management's responsibility, the statement of representations or for first time filing, the report of independent auditors, comparative balance sheets, comparative income statements, comparative statements of changes in equity, comparative cash flow statements, and yung notes to financial statements. So submission to SEC. Financial statements submitted to the SEC should be stamped received by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. For corporations filing under Rule 68, the external auditor must issue a supplementary written statement. So ito yung section 68. So, I have here a few slides para din sa ibang questions na na-capture namin dun sa survey. It's because we hear you. So, ito, sasagutin natin siya. Sabi dyan, sample of non-compliance. Thank you so much for your questions sa survey. Kasi baka yung ibang participants, ito rin yung questions nila. So, maganda na ma-discuss natin siya. So, sample of non-compliance with disclosures per SEC findings of previously reviewed efforts and the corresponding penalty for non-compliance. Okay. So, tayo kasi, every time na magre-renew tayo ng accreditation natin sa SEC, nagre-review talaga sila ng financial statements ng mga in-audit natin ng mga companies. So, we present them yung mga audited financial statements. So, what we have here is yung naging findings nila. I think last year lang, 2020. So, hindi ko na i-disclose yung name ng company. Pero ito yung ibang comments. So, sa auditor's report, sabi dito, based on the statement of financial position, the company incurred capital deficiency for financial year 2019-2020. However, there is no emphasis on matter paragraph in the auditor's report to address such matter. So, ang question nila dito is yung audit report natin. Kasi, ayun nga, capital deficiency daw dun sa comparative years. So, kumbaga may indication siya na going concern issue niya. So, wala daw tayo lang sa auditor's report. So, ito yung naging response natin sa kanila. We did not put emphasis paragraph since the company generated positive results or net income from operations in 2018. In 2019, negative results in operations is due to the occurrence of non-recurring transactions, particularly front-end fees and professional fees incurred in relation to bank borrowings and stamp duty. This is in accordance yan. So, we state them kung ano yung naging reference natin, bakit hindi tayo naglagay ng emphasis sa paragraph. So, yun yung naging response naman namin that it is duly noted. So, they accepted yung naging response natin. So, wala naman naging penalty for that. Next, yung notes to financial statements naman, financial instruments. So, before kasi, meron tayong tabular schedule na sinasubmit din sa SEC. So, isa sa naging comment nila is, yung tabular schedule daw natin of effective standards, nandun kasi lahat ng standards kung ano yung adopted, ano yung applicable sa company. So, sabi nila dito, the tabular schedule of effective standards and interpretations showed that the company adopted both PFRS 9 and PAS 39. So, since yung PAS 39 kasi napalitan na siya diba na PFRS 9, so dun sa tabular schedule, pareho siyang naging, nalagyan na check, parang gano'n, pareho siyang nalagyan ng check. yung na-adopted siya, PFRS 9 and FAST 39. So ito yung naging response natin. So we presented the tabular schedule in relation to the current fiscal year, which is 2019, that applies yung PFRS 9. And its comparative information naman for the fiscal year 2018, which is, ang nag-apply naman dun is yung PAS 39. So yeah, we believe that it will no longer be an issue in future years since the tabular schedule was permanently deleted in the amended SR 068. So, ayan, acknowledge naman ni SEC yan yung naging response natin. And simula naman last year, wala na tayong sinasabit na tabular schedule ng effective standards interpretations. Also, for financial instruments then, under Note 2, trade receivables and advances to related party states that an allowance for impairment of receivables are established when there is an objective evidence that the company will not be able to collect all amounts due, which seems to be in accordance with FAST 39. This is inconsistent with the same note under impairment, which is in accordance with PFRS 9 PCL. So ito, actually sinama ko talaga siya dito sa presentation para maging lesson siguro or maging but take note natin na we have to check yung mga accounting policies talaga ng accounting policies ng company sa financial statement. Kasi merong mga accounting policies na hindi na applicable for this year kasi nga due to change ng or update sa standards. So, ayan. Although medyo yung financial statement sa sobrang haba niya, parang pagbabasahin natin, parang nakaka-overwhelm din. Pero we really have to pay attention even in the smallest details. Kasi important siya. So dito, yung naging response natin, objective evidence is referred to under the accounting policy disclosures, which were the factors considered in PCL calculation. So dito parang sinabi lang natin na although it is yung accounting policy talaga din somehow similar din sa FAST 39, which is dapat PFRS 9 na gagamitin. So we just in-explain lang natin na kaya ganun yung naging accounting policy or ganun yung naging sentence or ganun yung naging construction ng sentence because there is already an objective evidence na nire-refer natin dun sa ECL calculation. So, tinanggap din naman siya na SEC. So, wala rin naman walang material of deficient So, walang naging material deficiency doon and wala rin siya naging penalty. Tapos, sa assets held for sale and assignment, so, na-note niya na incomplete disclosures on assets held for sale and assignment. So, yung naging response natin doon, meron kasi tayong mga accounts na related to each other, di ba? Mga ganun. So, dito, yung disclosure is complete sa note 14, deed of sales. So, ayan, parang ang ginawa natin, dun is, kinross-refer natin siya dun sa isang note din. Kasi dun sa isang note, na-present naman din natin siya naman. So, kaya wala naman tinanggap naman, in-acknowledge naman ni SEC yung mga naging response natin and walang naging penalties for this. Yung isa pa sa gather namin na question, what are the common mistakes the preparers commit? So dito, nilagay na natin yung mga common SEC findings sa financial statement. So, dito sa audit report, so ito yung isa sa mga SMC findings. The auditor's report failed to indicate the expiration date of licenses and accreditations of the auditing firm and the signing partners. So, very important na yung mga maliliit na details doon is ilalagay natin siya dun sa report kasi naging commission na sa audit report din, actually ito, kinuha ko lang to sa mga naging training ng SEC about uh, common findings nila. Hindi siya particularly sa atin SEC. So, ayan. So, the auditor's report failed to cover the supplemental documents required under SRC rules, yung darong kulang na reports. So, sa statement of financial position naman or sa phase naman, may mga material items daw that are not cross-referenced to related notes to financial statements. So, possible to na wala siyang notes. For example, malaki siya na account, material siya na account. For example, other non-current asset or other non-current liability na material yung amount pero wala siyang disclosure or wala siyang notes to financial statements that explains po or ano yung nature ng other non-current liability na yun. So, possible na ito yun. Or pwede rin siyang mga bali yung amounts. Like for example, naka-declare sa case natin is 1,000. Tapos pagdating dun sa notes natin, 1,001, mga ganun. So, ayan, pwede rin siyang There's no indication of the presentation currency. So, sa financial statements natin, meron tayo nalalagay din na basis of measurement or presentation. So, dapat i-measure natin na meron tayong mistate natin ano yung presentation currently yung financial statements. Incorrect classification of cash flows according to its activities, operating, investing, or financing. So, ayun. So, meron pa rin nagiging comment pa lang pagdating dito. So, we have to take note then or siguro i-refresh din natin yung mga minds natin about the classification ng cash flows. Major classes of gross cash receipts and payments are incorrectly presented on a net basis. Ayan. So, yung ibang mga gross cash receipts plus payments, pero nakapresent siya on a net basis. So, yun sa naging Sa inventories naman, yung accounting policy on measurement of inventories are cited in the notes to FS is not in accordance with PAS 2 or Section 3 of PFRS for SMEs. Ayan. So, kaya tayo, katulad ng nabanggit ko kanina, when we prepare financial statements or when we review financial statements, very important na bukod sa babasahin natin ng isang buo, siguro, it helps then if pag review natin siya, sabay-sabay like yung phase, tapos hanapin natin yung accounting policy niya and yung related notes. Next is for PPE naman. There are no accounting policies on initial recognition, subsequent measurement, and the recognition on PPE. So, diba based dun sa naging discussion simula kaninang umaga, accounting policy, palaging may accounting policy na incomplete disclosures on PPE. So, wala daw roll forward analysis of carrying amount of PPE, carrying amount of assets used as collaterals, estimated useful lives of each PPE, depreciation methods used. So, kanina na-discuss naman din ko na basic disclosure requirements for PPE. So, kailangan may roll forward. Tapos, din i-disclose din natin din, for example, may mga PPE tayo na naka-collateral. Based on the notes to financial statements, the company measured its PPE using the cost model. So, this is inconsistent with the statement of financial position, statement of changes in equity, which shows a revaluation, surplus account does support the use of the revaluation. So ito medyo material siya kasi inconsistent yung accounting policy nila. Next is yung financial risk management. So, yung financial risk management kasi it's a requirement sa full PFRS. So, meron talagang separate na note for financial risk management. For PFRS for SMEs, hindi naman siya required. I could still remember, nag-attend ako ng SEC training. Parang, yung discussion din siya ng mga SEC findings. Tapos, nagsalita din yung isang parang mataas from SEC din. Ano, parang kino-comment niya yung mga companies na SME. Like, sabi niya, naglalagay pa doon ng financial risk management yung ibang mga SME, tapos mali-mali naman. So, kumbaga parang ang point niya doon is hindi naman siya required for PFRS for SME. So, siguro, parang malimit lang din yung mga mistake or errors with financial statements. Hindi naman siya required. You can skip naman. So, there are no quantitative analysis of each financial risk. Walang disclosure ng credit quality of financial assets, no disclosure analysis of age of the financial assets, disclosure sa sensitivity analysis. So, lahat kasi ito under ng financial risk management na disclosure or needs. So, ito, sinabi niya pala dito, considering that the company adopted PFRS for SME, the discussion of financial risk management is not necessary. So, ayan, I think that covers my section or my training.